and welcome to United Church Online. We're so glad that you decided to join us today.
If you're new to United Church, we would love to be in touch with you. So why not fill in our Connect card on the link in the description or visit our website for more info.
So let's ready our Bibles, notebooks, and pens as we prepare to receive the word together.
So as we get into it, we are kicking off a new series today entitled Life Together. And we're unpacking and learning about the Jesus community, the Jesus way. What did Jesus intend when he put together a community? When he said things like, I will build my church. When you're reading the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus calls his disciples, what was his intention behind putting together this ragtag group of scollies that didn't know anything? This group of absolute gangsters. Like just, if you read the scriptures and you look at the disciples, you're like, yes, these oaks were something else. And so we're going to understand that Jesus obviously has a vision, an intended vision, and he's got one for all of us. He's got one for your life. He's got one for your family. He's got one for your future. He's got a vision for the lost. He's got a vision for eternity. But most of all, he's got a vision for his church. What is that vision? And so the series really is about developing a vision for God's preferred or God's intended community. So we're going to unpack. As we journey over the next few weeks, we'll look at how Jesus did community. What was Jesus' method when it came to doing life alongside others? And we look at what Jesus expects from his community and ultimately how Jesus empowers his community. And so hopefully this has a positive impact in us, and I really trust that this draws us closer together towards becoming a stronger body. And really what I'm hoping to do is this. It's the equivalent of this. Imagine, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, maybe there's someone in your world, someone in your life, maybe it's a spouse, a parent, a child, a close friend or a colleague in whom you see tremendous potential. Just think about it. Is there someone in your life that you know has so much potential, but they don't see it? Just imagine that frustration of knowing that there's so much that you have, that you possess, but you don't see it. And so they're always kind of playing themselves short, and they're never measuring up to their full potential. And you know that frustration of seeing more in someone that they see in themselves. That's really what I'm hoping for us to see, that God sees more in us as a combined community than we realize. And so because of that, we won't sell ourselves short. We won't make the excuses. We won't kind of settle for the setbacks and the inconveniences, but that we'd see what Jesus sees in us as a collective community and then move towards that. Because if we don't, the enemy will have you falling back onto the lowest possible excuse in your life, and then we always short-circuit our future growth. And so let's unpack this. We're going to dig into Matthew chapter 4. We're starting just before the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to track how Jesus forms his people. Matthew chapter 4:18. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting their nets into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come and follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and they followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John. They were in the boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets, and Jesus called to them, and immediately they left the boat and their father, and they followed him. Jump over to Matthew chapter 9, and it says this: as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. For those of you who might have watched the series The Chosen, which I think is a beautifully creative depiction, kind of shows you kind of how this unfolds, you know. Jump over to chapter 10, and you see all the disciples together. Jesus has now called all of them. It doesn't show him calling some of the others, but we see this in chapter 10. It says, these are the names of the 12 apostles. First it was Simon called Peter, his brother Andrew, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John, and Philip and Bartholomew and Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who ultimately betrayed him. And so we see that Jesus takes a small group of guys and somehow forms them into what we now know as the apostles, the foundation of the early church, the men who kind of set this whole movement of the church on track. And here's what he does. He begins by calling them. See, here's what we need to know. Jesus doesn't do anything accidentally or incidentally. They don't just happen to find themselves with him. It's not just like he didn't have any other choice. It's not like he was like, okay, this is who I'm left with. Oh, well, here we go. Fine, let's go, He doesn't do that. He calls them by name, by intention. And I need us to get this. For those of you who might find yourself wondering, like, what am I doing in church? Maybe Jesus called you here. Maybe you might not realize that you being here means Jesus saw something in you. Maybe you were at home and bored. Maybe you Googled churches in Vanderbijl. However you ended up here, could it be that Jesus looked at you and said, I want you to be a part of my community. There's something I see in you. There's something that you have. There's something that you possess that can be of the benefit of my larger people. I want you here. And at some point, Jesus reached out to you and said, come, follow me. I think all of us need to understand that Jesus isn't haphazard in what he does. Then once he calls them, what does he do? He begins to teach them, right? We see from Matthew chapter 4, the very next chapter, Matthew chapter 5, he begins the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. And so he teaches these new people that he has called. And what does he teach them? He teaches them who he is. I think it's so important that for many of us, especially if you are new in your Christian faith, there's going to be a season where you learn about who God is. Maybe some of us have preconceived ideas, preconceived philosophies, that God might be like this or might be like that. But he takes the time to teach them who he really is. And you might see it in John's gospel specifically, the phrases, I am, I am, I am. And he teaches them who he is. I am the bread of life. I am the narrow gate. I am the door. I am the way, the truth, and the life. He teaches them about who he is. Don't underestimate the seasons where we learn about God's character in the context of community. It's so important because together we are learning about the God that we serve. And then, not only does he teach them who he is, he then teaches them what he expects of them. This is who you are. This is who you are to be to others. This is what you are to do. Suddenly they begin to realize, we're not just a ragtag group of schollies. We actually have purpose. There's actually something on us. And when do they learn this? When Jesus says, okay, now you go cast out demons. What? No ways. And then what happens is they fail dismally. And they come back, I couldn't do it. And Jesus is patient with them. So we see how Jesus forms a community. He exposes them to his miracles. These guys get a front row seat, and my overactive imagination can't handle this. Sometimes I wonder how it unfolded where Jesus is turning water into wine. It's like, instructing people, and he looks over to his son and he goes, guys, check here, come on. And he does his thing. Like, I don't know. I don't know how he did it, but I can imagine them standing there just being amazed and puzzled and perplexed and going back and going, guys, what is going on? Like, why are we even here? And somehow he shows them his bigger vision. He challenges them and he calls them to higher. No disciple that came as they were left as they were. Think about it. We see in the beginning, these disciples come, and we see how some of them were, their personality, and how Peter was the hothead. He always spoke before he thought. It was that kind of thing. But by the end of it, when Jesus ascends to heaven in the book of Acts, Peter, the very same one, is the boldest of them all. We see how Jesus takes them where they are, and he forms and shapes them, and he challenges them. He calls them to higher, and they end up a different version of themselves by the time he leaves. And the same is true for us. When you and I enter a community, we start somewhere. You come from somewhere. You've got a background. You've got some struggles. And as we journey together, Jesus begins to form us, and something in us begins to blossom. Some of you discover you had gifts and talents you never had. Some of you discover that, hang on, I thought I wanted to do this with my life, but actually I want to do this. You discover you've got an inclination in you, and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later, you're a different version of who you were when you came in. And that's good for some of you who are new, that you realize 10 years from now, you're going to be a different version of the person you were when you came in. Because that's what Jesus does. But he does it in the context of community. And here's my favorite part. Jesus watches them get things wrong. He watches them fail. He watches them, they set out and they try and cast out a demon and they can't, and he comes back, and yes, he's frustrated, but he's like, okay, let me do another one. Watch me carefully this time, He watches them fail and get it wrong, but he's so gracious and patient with them. He doesn't give up on any of them, even Judas, which I think is probably the most fascinating character in the scriptures to me at some point. Even though Jesus knows exactly what he's about to do, he still gives him an opportunity to choose otherwise. And so I think it's important that we understand all of this happens in the context of community. At no point did Jesus go to Peter and his brother Andrew and say, look, I'm going to come visit you guys on Monday. In fact, I'm doing my Jerusalem run. You know, you guys are Monday, James and Zebedee, you guys are Tuesday, Bartholomew, Nathaniel, you guys are Wednesday, he doesn't do it individually for them. He calls them out of their comfort and he does it together for them. And the same is true for us. Jesus is doing something in our personal lives, all of us, but he does that together with all of us. He calls us out of our homes to meet together and then encourages us collectively. We worship Jesus collectively. He convicts us collectively. There's power in community. This is why Jesus begins to build what he calls the koinonia, the fellowship. A fellowship is the Greek word koinonia, and some of you might be familiar with it. It's a bit of a compound word. It's quite complicated to just translate into English as one thing because there's like 4 different dimensions to it. Firstly, it's fellowship. It's this active, close community, right? A group of people that commit to something. It also means sharing and participation where, you see it in Acts where it says, and the disciples were together and they shared everything they had. There's a common sharing for the greater good. There's a partnership which entails working together towards a shared vision. And so we ultimately see where God is taking us and we go there together. And then there's communion, this spiritual intimate union, both vertically and horizontally. Not just communion as in the breaking of bread, but like communion between each other. And that's what Jesus is building. He's building a koinonia, fellowship, an integrated way of living differently to the culture. And so we need to understand that Jesus is never just forming a person. He is always forming and shaping a people. And we get it wrong when we think more individually and isolated than we do communally. We miss the point, we miss the mark when we think Jesus is doing more in me than Jesus is doing through me and in us. And this is why so many people get it wrong. Why some people believe that they can be Christians and they don't need a church, because they've missed the point that it's not just about what God is doing in me, it's about what God is doing through us that I get to be a part of. We get it wrong when we think more in terms of isolation. He's shaping a people. And how does he shape a people? He uses people to shape people. I mean, it would be amazing if God can do his work in us individually on our own by ourselves, but no, he in his wisdom, he puts you around people. And what do people do? They're going to test you. They're going to challenge you. They're going to annoy you. They're going to frustrate you. But they will also bring out your greatest joy. People around you are going to show you where both your insecurities lie, but also where your passions lie. When you become passionate, it always usually involves people, an area of people. It's so important that we realize that God is working through and in and around people to shape us. See, the disciples were formed and shaped, but they were done so in the struggle of fellowship. When they were arguing, Jesus was able to step into that moment and encourage them. These two are walking along and they're trying to see who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom, right? There's always selfishness in a community. Someone wants more for themselves. And Jesus had to step into that moment and be like, do you really know what you're asking for? You want to be first? You need to be last. It's in those moments that Jesus ministers to us. And so when we look at this fellowship community, this koinonia that exists in the church, that Jesus is performing in and through and around us, we need to understand that there's a method, there's a process in which he follows. The same way he did it for the disciples is the same way he does it for us. 2 things that he does. Firstly, he calls us to himself. He starts by first and foremost calling us to himself, same way that he did with the disciples. Have a look at Mark chapter 3. It says, Jesus went up to the mountainside and he called to him those who he wanted, that they may come to him. And he appointed the 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. The starting point for this group of disciples was that they would draw near to Jesus. They would draw near to him individually and that they would draw near to him collectively. And it's in the drawing near to him that they began to get to know who he was. Why? Because he had proximity. In those moments, he began to spend time with him. He had meals with him. There was conversations. There was back and forth. There was teaching. They saw the moments when he was alone and he went out in solitude. They saw the moments where he did miracles. They saw him interact with people. They saw him get upset. And they stuck around. And they changed for the better. And so for you and I our first priority as a collective community needs to be to draw near to Jesus. We need to understand that Jesus is taking us and He is drawing us near to Himself. There's never a point where He's trying to do something inside of us apart from what He's trying to do in a community. And I think we need to see that, because otherwise we'll be tempted that if I don't see what I want to see in this community, let me just jump over to another community because maybe they've got what I want. No, Jesus put you there for a reason. If we are patient enough, we'll realize that the things Jesus puts inside of us will align to the space that Jesus puts us in. Does that make sense? And so our first priority needs to be to draw near to Him, because everything we do and everything we become flows from proximity, from fellowship with Jesus. And if we get this right, we begin to see that, the things that I've struggled with, I can help someone else with. And the thing that someone else struggled with, they can help me with. And the problems I'm facing, someone else has faced, and they can guide me through it, and they can encourage me through it. And that marriage is in trouble, but our marriage did well. And I remember when we were there, and I can help them, and they can help me, and we can help each other. And suddenly, there's camaraderie and help and encouragement because there's community. This is why every believer must prioritize the vertical relationship with Jesus first. What happens here will ultimately affect what happens here. When this is unhealthy, it actually shows the state of this. And we need to understand that. Normally people look at a community and they think, there's this and there's that. And we always tend to shift the blame there. But maybe that's a sign for us to go back and say, what's actually happening here? And you realize that for many people that blame the community, whenever they do step out and join another community, the same problems exist. And then soon you realize, you are the common denominator. It is you that the drama's always there where you are. It's not the church. It's you. Why am I like this? See, when there's fellowship, between people, we realize that collectively we point each other to Jesus. We point one another. When there's offense, we begin to challenge us. Hey, have you prayed this through? Let's go pray together. When there's hurt, we begin to journey with one another to resolve it. When there's unhappiness or bitterness, we begin to journey together. There's something that happens in here between us. But it all starts with this. My relationship with Jesus will help me endure with you and love you and serve you and seek your best interest because I've started here. When this is unhealthy, there's no ways I've got the capacity to love you, because I need to love you the way Christ loves, and I can't love like Christ loves if there isn't this to begin with. Does that make sense? And so when we fail to prioritize our communion with Jesus, our expectation and our experience of the church becomes distorted. That's when you've got people doing things like say, you know what, I don't feel fed here. There's no meat. We use all these spiritual, there's no meat. I'm getting milk. Yeah, but you're not supposed to get meat. You're supposed to serve one another. Eat your own meat at home. Come here filled so you can help feed others. See, when we start to become more selfish and we think about our self-interest, and then suddenly the church is not good enough for us anymore. That's the problem, when the vision becomes distorted because we're not thinking communally, we're thinking individually. We fail to realize that our goal is to point people to becoming like Jesus collectively. And I can play a role in that. When we confront each other and we challenge each other, see, when we get this wrong, we confront and challenge each other, and we fail to see the bigger picture, so it feels like a personal attack. Everything becomes personal. They came for me. They say, you'll never believe what they said to me. They said, and she said, and he said, and how? Or we're just doing what the scriptures command us to do. We are looking out for one another, and we are leading one another towards Jesus. When we do this, we're able to bear with one another, love one another, serve one another, be patient with one another. All of this happens when we understand the purpose of community. Does that make sense? I was reading a book by a guy called Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Some of you might have heard of him. He's a German pastor. He lived around about the 1940s. And, he passed away just after the 40s. And he was someone who ended up revolting against the Nazi regime of Hitler. because his faith just could not allow him to be okay with what was happening. And what he ended up doing is he built a small Christian community who stood in resistance to everything the Nazis were trying to do. And he did it so powerfully that he became a very prominent figure not long after his death, because he was ultimately executed by the Nazis. But what he did was build a community in the midst of adversity and in the midst of a war. He was able to build an incredibly strong Christian community by understanding the power of community. And he writes a book called Life Together, and this is what he says. He says, Christian community means community through Jesus and in Jesus Christ. There is no Christian community that is more than this, and none that is less than this. Whenever, or whether it's a brief single encounter or a daily community over years, Christian community is solely this: we belong to one another only through Jesus and in Jesus. He reminds us that the foundation of any Christian community starts with Jesus. The moment we think it's about anything else, we've missed the point. It's never more, it's never less. It's never about my personal interest. It's never about it's not my personal growth project. It's not my little comforter that every time, it's all of those things eventually, but it starts with Jesus. Otherwise, people end up becoming the means to our end. And we use people for our personal gain. And when people can no longer serve us, we'll move on to the next group. The goal of this is that when we are through Jesus and in Jesus, we help one another. Does that make sense? And so firstly, Jesus starts by calling the disciples to himself. And then Jesus calls the disciples to each other. And we see this, that once he's taught them and he's spent time with them, and it's about 3 years later, and he has what we would know as the Last Supper. They just knew it as supper. They didn't know it was the last one. And so in that moment, he begins to teach them. And you have a look at what it says. I read this verse earlier. John 13, it says, "A new commandment I give to you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." In other words, I'm going to be away. I'm not going to be here anymore. And so I won't be the face of this movement anymore. But the way which you guys relate to one another will become the determining factor, will become the thing that others get to know us by the camaraderie that exists here. And in that moment, Jesus commissioned them, called them to one another, and gave them a vision of what the future will look like. Jesus calls the disciples into community, and he calls them to one another. I can only imagine in that room, we've already made reference to it, but in that room, even in the Last Supper, there was a moment of frustration where, can you imagine Jesus like, one of you guys are going to betray me? And suddenly everybody starts doubting themselves. Is it me? It's not me. And then suddenly everybody becomes skeptical of one another. It's you. It's you. But in that moment, we see that there's a beautiful unity. If you read the book of John, the Gospel of John, shows how Jesus begins to wash their feet. And he says, I'm setting a new example for you. You need to do the same. And he does all of these things that sets a pattern for how they are to live and who they are to be. And we get a front row seat at how he calls them to one another. We see how they argue with one another. We see how personal interest sometimes gets its way, and how he dissipates that, and how he points their eyes towards the bigger picture. Because community is the training ground for everything that Jesus teaches. Where else are we going to outwork all the things that Jesus calls us to? When he speaks about loving one another and forgiving one another, where does that happen outside of community? Where does that happen where we can put into practice the gifts that God has placed in us, where we get to outwork the revelation he gives us? It's so beautiful to see that this happens so often. My sermon preparation process is normally a couple of weeks in advance, and I begin to think and ponder on something, and I begin to write down notes, and then the week before I preach it, I lock myself away on a Wednesday, and I begin to structure and write it out. And then when I finally preach it on Sunday, I'm thinking, I hope this makes sense. And then as I speak to people, at least 4 or 5 people on an average Sunday say to me, you won't believe, we've been speaking about that this week. Or you won't believe we were just having that discussion. You won't believe that verse you read came up in my devotional time this week. And suddenly you realize that God doesn't give individual revelation, he gives collective revelation. That whatever he's saying to me, he's saying to multiple people, and that's how he leads his church. And it's so important that if we have that vertical relationship, right, that we realize God is speaking to all of us at various times about various things in the community. That's why we need to be connected to community. That's where we learn to obey the voice of the Holy Spirit when he prompts us to pray. For some of you, you know what it feels like you just have a prompt, like, I wonder how so-and-so is doing, I need to pray for them. And then what happens, sometimes busyness kicks in. A week or two later, you run into that person. You're like, hey, I thought about you the other day. Oh man, I was going through the most. I should have prayed for you when I had that feeling. You realize obedience to that prompt is so important because God lays people on our hearts at random times, and we need to hold them up in prayer. God, we need to be obedient to his voice. I remember a few years ago, I was at a youth conference, and we were praying for a bunch of young people, and we were just moving through the room, laying hands on them. And as I was laying hands on people, this one young, and I think he might have been early teens, man. I mean, he was quite young. And he came to me, and he's like, hey, you could see he was nervous, you know. It's like, hey, I just feel like I need to pray for you. And I'm thinking, oh man, I'm supposed to be praying for you, but okay. And so he closed, I put up my hands and I close my eyes and I'm like, cool, pray for me. And he begins to pray. And here's the thing, I heard nothing this kid said. I mean, it was heavy breathing and nervousness. Like you could see, this was the first time he was doing this. And I pray. But here's the thing, he was being obedient. And if I was selfish, I would walk away being silly kid, And I remember years ago, hearing someone said this to me in this church, oh no, I don't allow people to pray for me in church because I never know what demons they're passing into me. I'm like, you've got the wrong vision. Also, is this not the place where God is more powerful? Can we just chill, Because that's when we miss the point that this is training ground. Yes, someone's going to pray for you and they're going to get it wrong, and that's okay. Because you don't know how they were acting in obedience. Someone's going to pray over you and you're going to have no idea what they're saying, and you take it back to the Holy Spirit and trust. God, I don't know what he said, but I'm going to trust that somehow you know what was happening there. Because if we make it all about ourselves, we miss the opportunity that God is doing something in and through us. That makes sense? And so this is where we need to be encouraged. This is where we are encouraged to reconcile and overcome offense and forgive one another before bitterness settles in. This is why those one another verses are so important, because they outplay themselves in the context of community. And when we get it wrong, this is where we extend grace to one another. This is where we understand that some of us might be further ahead in the journey. When someone gets it wrong, we don't judge them, we hold their hand and we help them do better. This is where we realize that all of us are at different points in our journey, but we are not there until we are all there. And so we need to journey together. It's so important that when one of us gets it wrong, that the others surround them in order to help them get there. Just like Jesus was patient with his disciples. He was gracious with them when they got it wrong. We need to do the same for one another. So here's what it looks like. When we commit to community, and I want to encourage you, for those of you, I don't know where you're at in your relationship with church, but let the series be the resolve where you decide to not be transactional in your relationship with the church. Don't be transactional. Don't be 1 foot in, 1 foot out, kind of here, there, somewhere, Commit to this, because when we commit to this, it is a commitment of both individual and collective calling. I'm committing to say God is calling me closer to himself by name, like he did with all the disciples. He's calling me. I want you, follow me alongside everyone else. It is an individual and a collective calling. And what he does in us, he does in us and in us. Does that make sense? Then we commit to collective teaching and shaping and formation and discipleship. No one is beyond learning from someone else. Collectively, we are being discipled. We are being shaped. We are being formed. We need to allow that process to happen. There's nothing worse than someone in a community who is unteachable, that no one can help, no one can shape, no one can teach. It just becomes resistance. That person, a person like that ultimately does more damage to the community. We need to commit. When we do this, we commit to fellowship and a life of partnership and a commitment to one another. So can I encourage you, do those things. Commit and say, look, I'm going to step out of my comfort zone. If up until now I've just been playing it safe, just protecting my time or protecting whatever it is, step beyond your comfort zone and allow the community to be the community to you. Will it be messy? Yes, it will. But there's a greater vision involved. If there's unity and fellowship here, there will be unity and fellowship here. The unity and fellowship that exists between us and Jesus needs to be stronger than this because it will ultimately affect what happens here. Everything about God's intended heart for community points toward a collective partnership. Don't buy the lie that you're better off alone. Don't buy the lie that it's better for you to be isolated. Don't buy the lie that it's better for you to be on your own and do this on your own and just take care of yourself. That is a lie the enemy tells us because we short-circuit our own spiritual growth when we believe that lie. It's only when we integrate into community that we begin to see a blossoming. That suddenly, oh wow, my life is richer because of others. We need to believe that and we'll see it happen. Does that make sense? So as we close, Psalm chapter 133, I love this psalm. It's a psalm that we prayed through when we were busy forming the foundation of our church, United Church. It says this, how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. For there the Lord bestows a blessing, even life forevermore. There's something so beautiful when there's unity and fellowship present within a community. And the scriptures show us that when we get that right, God pours a blessing out. A blessing that is so unique that everybody on the outside looks into it and sees something worth aspiring to. That's what we possess. We don't have to go search for it. It's right here. We simply just need to trust God to make it evident to us. Does that make sense?
We trust that this message was helpful to you.
We would love for you to stay in touch. So follow us on our Instagram at United Church SA or contact us on our WhatsApp number. Be blessed.